Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 through 13. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples, as you are of this day. A whole generation has come and gone, and the people who crossed the Red Sea have almost all died out. A new generation of wandering Israelites who didn't know life other than wandering in the desert now stand across from the Jordan River, awaiting the opportunity to move into the promised land. Moses is not going to go with them. If you remember, he sinned in the wilderness. Numbers 20 and verse 12, God says, "You will not go in to the land." Boy, there's a number of ways to look at that, all of which are important. And as I mentioned before, there's a number of ways to study these books. This is not the only way. If it looks like we ever sugarcoat, it's because I'm trying to look for the good news of the gospel, not to explicate the entire story. You could look at that and be reminded that leadership is hard work and serious work. Leaders bearing the consequences that belong to all the people. That's a New Testament teaching too, you know. But I can't help but notice something else in this story, a part of the gospel. You've got one man bearing the consequences that apply to all the people. That reminds me of something in the New Testament. And here's something else. Moses represents the law. The law can't bring you into the promised land. Instead, you're going to be brought into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua. Can anybody guess Joshua's Greek name? Jesus. Moses reminds this generation of the law given to their fathers. And he repeats much of what we've already read in the book of Exodus. But he also adds some things. This is another generation. So he repeats the law, but he tells it to some people in some new ways. Notice how he tries to speak in the language of the people, which sometimes varies from generation to generation. And so there are blessings, there are curses, there are further pronouncements, but the end result of the book of Deuteronomy is that God's people are reminded of what they were rescued for. Because of God's promise, the one he gave long before he ever rescued them from Egypt, they're going to enter the promised land. Long before he heard their cries in Egypt, long before he brought them through the Red Sea, long before he gave them the law in Exodus 19, God told Abraham in Genesis 17, verses 1 through 8, that he was going to lead his people and they were going to have the land of Canaan. What do we learn about God from the book of Deuteronomy? A couple of things come to mind. All law talk should be seen as a story about God. Parents get this instinctively. I did not understand this growing up as one under law, because what I would think is these rules are cumbersome. They don't fit well. Why doesn't Dad trust me? Why does he appreciate my freedom? Why doesn't he see me as an equal? I'm all of 11 years old. Why can't he treat me as an adult? You know why. I don't know what I don't know. And the laws were not given by my parents in my house. They weren't given to try to keep me under his thumb. They were given for my good. I just didn't know it. God says in Deuteronomy, I want you to love me with all your heart and soul, and I want you to keep the statutes which were given for your good. So all law talk should be seen as a story about God. Look in Deuteronomy 6, verses 20 through 24. I want you to notice how any question about the law should begin with a statement about God and his faithfulness. Deuteronomy 6, verses 20 through 24. When your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders, great and grievous, against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as we are to this day. You know, it's easy when you have a 20-month-old to talk about how I plan to discipline my child. It'll be different when it actually, when things are really bad, all my 10 commandments will turn into 10 suggestions. But I like to think that maybe somewhere along the way, instead of just saying because I said so, maybe I'll get so used to saying this that Grace will get so tired of hearing the story. Why do I got to obey you? Well, let me tell you, it all started a long time ago when God made the world. You see what is happening here? All law talk is talk that starts with, well, let me tell you about God, how we were lost, how he rescued us from Egypt, and he brought us to the desert, and then he gave us rules that make us a people. So we know who we are, we know who he is, and it was meant to keep us alive and safe. That's the purpose of the law. I notice also that love for God comes first. In Deuteronomy 5, verses 6 through 21, we have the 10 commandments again. And wouldn't you know it, just like in Exodus, in Deuteronomy 5, he begins talking about the 10 commandments by talking about God, who he is and what he's done. And then you have the commandments. And the first 4 commandments can be summarized this way. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. First, work on that relationship with God. And if you can get the vertical relationship right, the horizontal follows, and also it flows out of your vertical relationship. Where do you get the courage and the motivation to love others when they don't seem lovable? You get it from the love you receive from God. So work on that horizontal relationship. That's laws 1 through 4. And then don't forget the second. That's like the first, but flows from it. To love your neighbor as yourself. That's the last 6 commandments. What else do we learn about God? Well, Moses thinks that the wilderness wanderings, somewhere between 38 and 42 years, was an opportunity to see the grace of God. Some of these Bible writers, Paul is in prison in Philippians. Paul's in prison. And he writes to a church that's struggling with criticism and what's the word I'm looking for here? When a church is getting beaten up, a church is going through persecution. There's a church that's going through persecution. And he says in the end of chapter 1, remember now he's in prison, it has been appointed to you to have the same gracious gift that God's given me, to suffer for his sake. And you're thinking, I would like to exchange my gift. Paul says, isn't this great? We got a chance to suffer, and by suffering, we learn to be more like God. Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 through 5, Moses says, look back over the last 40 years. Isn't it great? When you were going through the wilderness, when you were hungry, God gave you manna. And look at your clothes. Your clothes didn't wear out. Look at your shoes. Your shoes didn't wear out. For 40 years, God has shown himself faithful and present to you. Last thing that I learned about God from the book of Deuteronomy, obeying laws was always meant to reflect God. Doing what God says to do is a way of being like him. This is a New Testament idea as well. Think about Matthew chapter 5, where in Matthew 5, for example, verses 44 through 45, he talks about how if you love your enemies, then you shall, I'm going to get the quote all wrong. Matthew 5, 44 through 45. I say unto you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. What does he mean, so that you be sons of your Father in heaven? Wait, you mean only if I do good things am I considered a child? No, what it means is so that you will represent your Father. You'll look like him, you'll act like him, you'll be like him. When you act like him, you look like him. Israel was supposed to emulate what God had done for them. Deuteronomy 10, verse 19. Love the sojourner, the outsider who comes into your camp. Love the sojourner. Why should I love the sojourner? Because you were once sojourners in the land of Egypt. Look in Deuteronomy 15, verses 13 through 15. And when you let him go free from you, this is talking about somebody who's in your jurisdiction. When you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, out of your winepress. When somebody who's been your responsibility is now going to be set to leave, make sure you give him all of this extra stuff. Why? As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Doing what God says is a way of being like him, and Israel was called to emulate what God had done for them. And they were called to reflect the character of God. Back to Deuteronomy chapter 10, look in verse 14. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Now verse 17. The Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who's not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow. He loves the sojourner, giving to him food and clothing. Why should you love your neighbor as yourself? Because God loves your neighbor like he loves you. So we learned some things about God. What do we learn about Christ? The story that I painted for you, the story is gospel because the story calls for obedience. It calls for sacrifice. It says there are curses when you break God's covenant, and there are blessings when you keep God's covenant. And in the New Testament, when Jesus shows up on the scene, he says some interesting things. You know, he quotes from Deuteronomy when he's in his battle with Satan in the desert. He quotes from Deuteronomy about obeying God's law. In Matthew 5 and verse 17, Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. When he dies on the cross, his perfect life has now led to a perfect sacrifice. And so the veil of the temple, the veil that separated the people from the holy place, was ripped, but not from the bottom to the top like a person would do. It's ripped from the top to the bottom. This is a 20-foot tall veil. And it's ripped from top to bottom as God allows us to enter the Holy of Holies, lets us enter the promised land because of what he did. The law was given for our good. Romans 7, verses 10 through 12 says, what was the problem? Was the problem the law? Of course not. The law was holy, righteous, and good. The problem is in the mirror. So what we needed was a perfect Savior and a perfect sacrifice. And I love this line, and I got this from a book I was reading the other day. I've got it quoted here somewhere. Jesus secured the divine blessings of the covenant by taking upon himself the punishment that comes from disobeying the covenant. He did not disobey the covenant, but he took the curses of the law upon himself so that you and I might enjoy the blessings of the covenant. What do we learn about faith, forgiveness, and hope? Oh, last thing about Christ. Christ is our Joshua. You know this. What do we learn about faith, forgiveness, and hope? God anticipates the failings of his people, even as he gives them the law. Okay, here's the pattern, and you see it throughout the Old Testament. Sin leads to judgment, which leads to grace, which leads to restoration, which leads to sin, which leads to judgment, which leads to grace, which leads to restoration. Deuteronomy chapter 30 lays this out. And here's a summary. I got this from a guy named Christopher Wright, and says, here's the summary of Deuteronomy 30, and it's so our story, isn't it? First, God reminds Israel. He says, I redeemed you, and I made a covenant with you. God's given them a law to bless them, and they've committed to keeping it. However, God knows that Israel's not going to keep the law. They're going to fail. This happens over and over again. So in Deuteronomy 30, it says, God made a promise, you made a promise, but you failed. And he says it in such a way that 20, 30, 40 years from now, you should be able to read this again, and you can tell it with new illustrations. God made a covenant, you promised you'd keep your end, but God knew you wouldn't. Therefore, God is going to have to keep his word. He's going to have to bring the curses of this covenant that Israel's going to incur because of their unfaithfulness. Through other nations, God's going to bring judgment, and then Israel's going to be forced out of their land and scattered among the nations. But judgment does not have to be the final word. It doesn't have to be Israel's final condition. There can be hope beyond judgment. And God is a God of mercy and grace and love who called them when they had nothing to offer. He led them when they were rebellious. And now that he's allowed the curses of the covenant to fall upon them, if nothing else, to teach them for their own good, he stands ready and willing to bring them back. And not just that. Deuteronomy 30 says God will enable them to come back. So choose life, not death. His grace continues to be present. Can't you hear the New Testament in that? That God says, I want you to live a certain way. And I know that you won't live up to all that I ask. But I will Keep my end of the covenant in both ways. That is, I will allow you to face consequences for your bad actions, but trust me, it's for your own good. And with my Spirit in you, I will enable you to do what needs to be done and ought to be done, so that you can live like me if you're willing to give in to what I do for you. Number 4, what do we learn about being the people of God? Deuteronomy tells us that God envisions a people who will live in loving obedience to God, their King, and that they'll do it in such a way that it will be a model to all the other nations. It will be a witness about who God is, and people won't be able to help but say good things about God because of you. Look in Deuteronomy 4, verses 5 through 8. See, I have taught you statutes and rules, as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people, who, when they hear all of these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? If I could put this in different words, tell me if you heard this before. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify the Father who is in heaven. Those are words on the lips of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And what he's saying is, this was always God's intention. When he gives his people a way to live, it's for your own good, and it's to be a model for the rest of the world, so people will see you and say, I want what you've got, and I want the God that you serve. That is a model we see over and over again in the Bible. Think about 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, I want worship to be the kind of thing where somebody walks in and they see what you're doing and they say, I want to know more about the God you serve. Okay, here are some questions for you to be thinking about this week based on Deuteronomy. What drives your relationship with God? Is it fear or is it gratitude? There is no doubt that there is fear in the book of Deuteronomy. But did you see what prefaces all the laws? What's supposed to drive the story is, look what my God did for you. Do you want to know your Creator better? Or are we just trying to avoid his anger? Do we view God's instructions as things that are meant to hold us back, or as things that are meant to free us up? I'll tell you something. The person who says, I'm under no law except myself, is under slavery stronger than they know themselves. Being a slave to your own passions and desires is the worst kind. How does your view of God affect your answer to these questions? And who would know best how a human being should live in order to experience life most fully than the one who made us and then shows us how to live? And then finally, whose effort secures your relationship with God? I know Deuteronomy has all these rules, but none of those seem to be the thing that people fall back on when they think about what makes them holy in the sight of God. What they fall back on is a story about God who rescued a people from Egypt, a God who gave manna when they didn't deserve it, a God who continued to offer his promise and blessings. Whose effort secures your relationship with God? Where does the Spirit of Christ dwell? I hope the answer to that is, he dwells in me. You can see it by how I live. And I live that way, not out of fear, but out of gratitude, as we go on our way rejoicing that we are facing hope of the promised land because we already live in the promised Son.